Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The knock that changed everything. Linda Harper had always found comfort in the predictability of her quiet suburban neighborhood. At 65, she was a woman of routines, preferring the steady rhythm of her days over the unpredictability of change. Her mornings began with tea on her porch, the warm sun casting a golden glow over her carefully tended garden. Each blade of grass, each blooming rose, was a testament to the order she had cultivated in her life, especially after losing her husband 5 years ago. For Linda, change was something to avoid. The world around her felt like it was moving too fast, new technologies, different faces in her community, and a shift in the traditions she once knew. But nothing unsettled her, quite like the news she heard that morning. Her best friend, Margaret, had arrived with her usual cheerful demeanor, clutching a tin of freshly baked muffins. They sat together in Linda's kitchen, as they did every Tuesday morning, sipping coffee and chatting about neighborhood gossip. "Linda," Margaret began, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone, "did you hear about the new family moving into the Roberts house?" Linda tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "No, but I've seen the for sale sign come down." "Who are they?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. "Well, I overheard the realtor talking at the grocery store." "It's a big family, Linda. A couple with 3 kids." Linda frowned. The Roberts house was a charming, single-story home with a spacious yard. It had been a peaceful haven for an elderly couple for decades. 3 kids? That's a lot of noise. Margaret nodded solemnly. "And the realtor said they're not from around here." "What do you mean?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with unease. Margaret's pause was heavy with meaning. "You know, they're not like us." Linda set down her coffee, her grip on the mug tightening. She didn't like where this conversation was headed. "Margaret, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm just saying we need to be careful," Margaret replied, lowering her voice. "This neighborhood has always been quiet, respectful. We've got to make sure it stays that way." Linda nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. She had worked so hard to create a sanctuary in her home and garden. The idea of noisy children and unfamiliar faces disrupting that peace filled her with dread. The arrival. A week later, Linda stood at her living room window, peering through the lace curtains as a moving truck pulled up next door. Her heart sank as she watched the scene unfold. The new family was here. A man stepped out of the driver's seat first. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident stride. His dark skin gleamed in the midday sun as he walked around the truck, opening the back door for his wife. She was elegant and graceful, her curly hair framing a warm smile as she gazed at their new home. Then came the children, a teenage girl and 2 younger boys. The boys were bursting with energy, darting across the lawn, their laughter carrying through the neighborhood. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she observed the scene. It wasn't just the noise or the activity that unsettled her. It was the unfamiliarity, the feeling that her safe, predictable world was shifting beneath her feet. She turned away from the window, her stomach churning with anxiety. Perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps she did need to keep a closer watch on things. The first encounter. The next morning, Linda was out in her garden, pruning her rose bushes. She prided herself on her garden, it was her sanctuary, her masterpiece. As she snipped away at the faded blooms, she heard the sound of laughter. Glancing up, she saw the 2 boys from next door, playing catch in their front yard. The ball flew through the air, landing dangerously close to her property line. Linda's heart raced as she imagined the ball crashing into her roses, undoing years of hard work. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. The boys stopped, turning to look at her with wide, curious eyes. "Yes, ma'am," one of them replied politely, holding the ball close to his chest. "This is a quiet neighborhood," Linda said, her tone firm. "We don't appreciate loud games or balls flying around. You need to be more careful." The boys exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension. "We're sorry," the other boy said. "We didn't mean to bother you." Linda huffed, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." She turned back to her roses, her hands trembling slightly as she resumed her pruning. But the encounter left her feeling unsettled. The boys hadn't been rude or disrespectful. If anything, they had been more polite than she expected. The call. Despite the boy's apology, Linda found herself growing increasingly agitated in the days that followed. She noticed every laugh, every shout, every moment of activity from the house next door. Each sound felt like an intrusion, a challenge to the peace she had worked so hard to maintain. Finally, one afternoon, Linda reached her breaking point. The boys were playing basketball in the street, their sneakers scuffing the pavement as they passed the ball back and forth. Linda watched from her window, her frustration boiling over. When the ball bounced into her yard, narrowly missing her flower bed, Linda felt her heart race with indignation. Without a second thought, she picked up the phone and dialed 911. "There are children causing a disturbance in our neighborhood," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling with emotion. "They're playing unsupervised, and it's becoming a problem." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent to address the situation. As Linda hung up the phone, she felt a surge of vindication. She was protecting her home, her neighborhood. It was the right thing to do, or so she told herself. But as Linda stood at her window, waiting for the police to arrive, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. The boys hadn't been malicious or disrespectful. They were just kids. Still, Linda brushed the thought aside. She had made the call, and now it was up to the police to handle the situation. Little did she know, the officer who arrived would turn her world upside down. The line drawn. Linda had barely slept after her encounter with Chief Jackson. The thought of her pristine neighborhood changing filled her with a sense of loss she couldn't explain. It wasn't just about the boys playing basketball or the laughter that floated from their backyard, it was something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to confront. The next morning, Linda slipped out into her garden before dawn. The rising sun painted her roses in hues of soft pink and gold. She clipped a few spent blossoms, her mind churning. She replayed the scene with Chief Jackson again and again in her head. His calmness had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She spotted Carol walking down the street and waved her over. "I just don't know what to do about them," Linda said as Carol approached. She gestured vaguely toward the Jackson house. Carol, always ready to stoke the embers of discontent, leaned in. "Well, Linda, if you're not careful, they'll take over. You can't let your guard down. You've seen what happens when things change too much. It all goes downhill." Linda nodded but felt an unfamiliar twinge of doubt. Still, she resolved to monitor the situation closely. The basketball incident. Later that day, Linda's vigilance turned into an obsession. She positioned herself by her window, keeping a notebook at hand. Every time the Jackson twins so much as walked down the street, she scribbled a note. 12:15 p.m., boys running, being noisy. 2:45 p.m., loud music coming from their backyard. 5 p.m., ball nearly hits flowerbed again. By evening, her notebook was full of minor grievances that, in her mind, added up to a neighborhood under siege. That night, a knock startled her. She opened the door to see Rachel Jackson standing there, holding a plate of cookies. "Hi, Mrs. Hilton," Rachel said, her smile warm and genuine. "I thought we could try again. I'd love for you to come over for coffee sometime. We've noticed you love gardening, and I'd really like to ask you for tips." Linda froze, the invitation catching her off guard. Before she could think, she blurted, "Thank you, but I'm very busy." Rachel's smile faltered just slightly. "Of course. Anytime," she said before retreating. Linda closed the door, her chest tightening. Why was she feeling so unsettled? She placed the cookies on the counter and tried to ignore the guilt creeping in. The call. The next afternoon, Linda was trimming her hedges when she heard the boys again, their laughter and the sound of a basketball echoing down the street. She saw them dribbling close to her garden and felt a surge of irritation. "That's it," she muttered. She stormed inside and grabbed her phone. She wasn't going to let them ruin her garden or her peace. When she called the non-emergency police line, her voice trembled with indignation. "There are kids causing a disturbance near my property," she said. "They're loud and disrespectful." The dispatcher promised to send an officer. Linda hung up, her pulse racing. This was the second time she'd called, and deep down, she knew it wasn't about the noise. It was about control, about keeping her world exactly as it had always been. But when the squad car pulled up, her confidence wavered. It was Chief Jackson again. His calm, authoritative presence left her feeling like a scolded child before he even said a word. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hilton," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "I understand there's been another concern?" Linda stammered, her carefully rehearsed complaints scattering in the face of his steady gaze. "Yes, Chief. The boys, they're always playing so close to my garden. I can't have them ruining my roses." Chief Jackson nodded slowly. "I've spoken to them about being careful. They've assured me they're staying on the street, which is public property. I understand your concern, but I hope we can find a way to coexist peacefully." Linda bristled at the word coexist. It made her feel as though she were the one causing the problem. She stood silent as he left, her frustration simmering beneath a layer of embarrassment. Carol's advice. That evening, Linda invited Carol over for tea, eager for validation. "I called the police again today," she said, setting down a tray of cookies, Rachel's cookies, though she didn't mention that part. Carol's eyes lit up. "Good for you, Linda. Someone needs to hold them accountable. Did they get a warning?" Linda hesitated. It was Chief Jackson again. "He handled it." Carol leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "That's what I was afraid of. He's protecting his own. You can't trust people like that, to be fair." Linda nodded, though a knot tightened in her chest. "You're right," she said, but the words felt hollow. A different perspective. The next morning, Linda was startled by a knock on her door. This time, it was the Jackson twins, holding a handwritten note. "We wanted to say sorry if we upset you, ma'am," one of them said. "Our dad says we should always try to make things right." Linda blinked, speechless. She read the note, which promised the boys would be quieter and more careful. It ended with an apology and their names signed in neat handwriting. For the first time, Linda felt a crack in her resolve. These weren't the unruly troublemakers she had painted them to be. They were just kids, polite, earnest, and trying to do the right thing. That afternoon, as Linda sat on her porch, she found herself watching the Jackson family again. This time, though, she didn't feel anger. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar, a yearning for connection. Rachel was teaching the boys to bake, their laughter spilling out of the open kitchen window. Christopher was setting up a basketball hoop in their driveway, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. Linda's heart ached. It had been years since her home had been filled with that kind of warmth. Since George's passing, her world had grown smaller and quieter, but also lonelier. For the first time, Linda wondered if the Jacksons weren't intruding on her peace, but offering her something she had been missing all along. The turning point. That evening, Linda did something she hadn't done in years. She baked an apple pie, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling her kitchen. As she placed it in a basket, she hesitated. What would she say? How would they react? But as she approached the Jacksons' door, she saw the twins peek out the window. "Mom. Mrs. Hilton's here," one of them shouted, his excitement evident. Rachel opened the door, her face lighting up with surprise. "Mrs. Hilton, hi. What a lovely surprise." I brought you this," Linda said, holding out the pie. "I wanted to say thank you for the cookies. They were delicious." Rachel's smile widened. "Thank you so much. Please, come in." As Linda stepped inside, she felt her fear and anger begin to dissolve. The Jacksons' home was warm and inviting, filled with laughter and the smell of dinner cooking. It reminded her of her own house when George was alive, before she had let the silence take over. That evening, as Linda sat with the Jacksons and listened to their stories, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit: her world wasn't being destroyed. It was expanding. And for the first time in years, Linda didn't feel alone. Walls crumbling. Linda left the Jacksons' house that evening, feeling both lighter and unsettled. She hadn't laughed like that in years, nor had she felt so genuinely welcomed by strangers. Yet, as she crossed the threshold into her own quiet home, the silence seemed heavier than ever. She stood in her living room, looking around. The walls, once a comforting cocoon, now felt stifling. Pictures of her late husband, George, smiled down from their frames. She sighed, brushing her fingers over one of the photos. "Is this what you'd want for me, George?" she murmured. "To shut everyone out?" The HOA meeting. A week later, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, HOA, meeting convened in Carol's spacious living room. Linda attended, as she always did, sitting in her usual seat by the window. Carol wasted no time bringing up the Jackson issue. "I think we need to have stricter regulations about noise and property upkeep," Carol said, her voice sharp. "We've worked hard to make this neighborhood what it is. We can't let things start slipping now." Several heads nodded in agreement. Linda found herself squirming. She had always been the first to support Carol's initiatives, but something felt off this time. "What do you think, Linda?" Carol prompted, her eyes narrowing. Linda hesitated, feeling the weight of the room's gaze. She thought of Rachel's warm smile, the twins' earnest apology, and Chief Jackson's unwavering patience. "I think," Linda began, her voice trembling. "I think we should be careful not to alienate our new neighbors. They've been nothing but kind and respectful. Maybe we should focus on building a community, not dividing it." The room fell silent. Carol's face darkened. "Linda, you've always been the first to stand up for our standards. What's changed?" Linda met her gaze. "Maybe it's time the standards included more than just rules. Maybe they should include compassion, too. A quiet transformation." In the days following the meeting, Linda felt a subtle shift within herself. She began spending less time by the window, watching the Jacksons, and more time tending to her garden. For the first time in years, she felt inspired to make it truly beautiful, not as a barrier, but as a welcome sight. One afternoon, she caught Rachel walking by with a basket of groceries. Linda called out, before she could stop herself. "Rachel." Rachel turned, surprised but smiling. "Hi, Mrs. Hilton. I was wondering," Linda said, her cheeks flushing, "if you'd like to come over for tea sometime. I'd love to share some gardening tips," and, she hesitated. "Well, I'd just like to get to know you better." Rachel's face lit up. "I'd love that. How about tomorrow afternoon?" Linda nodded, her heart fluttering with nervous anticipation. Tea and understanding. The next day, Linda prepared her finest china, dusting off the tea set she hadn't used in years. When Rachel arrived, she brought a loaf of homemade banana bread, its aroma filling the kitchen. As they sipped tea, Rachel shared stories about her life. She spoke of her job as a nurse, her passion for baking, and her dreams for her boys. "I just want them to grow up feeling safe and loved," Rachel said, her voice soft. "That's why we moved here. I thought this neighborhood would be perfect for them." Linda felt a pang of guilt. "I haven't exactly made it easy for you, have I?" she admitted. Rachel smiled kindly. "It's never easy being the new family. But I appreciate you inviting me over. It means a lot." As the afternoon wore on, Linda found herself opening up about her own life, her love for gardening, her memories of George, and the loneliness she had felt since his passing. Rachel reached across the table, her hand covering Linda's. "It sounds like you've been through a lot. Maybe we can help each other. I'd love for the boys to learn about gardening from you. And we could bake together sometime. Your apple pie was incredible." Linda laughed, the sound surprising her. I'd like that. The neighborhood barbecue. Word of Linda and Rachel's newfound friendship spread quickly. To everyone's surprise, Linda proposed hosting a neighborhood barbecue to officially welcome the Jacksons. Carol, skeptical but intrigued, stopped by to question her. Are you sure about this, Linda? What if it gets out of hand? Linda smiled. I'm sure, Carol. It's time we stopped worrying about what might go wrong and started celebrating what could go right. The barbecue was a resounding success. The Jackson twins played basketball with the neighborhood kids, their laughter mingling with the aroma of grilled burgers and fresh lemonade. Chief Jackson manned the grill, flipping burgers with practiced ease, while Rachel chatted with neighbors over plates of homemade desserts. Linda stood by the garden, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, the street felt alive, not with conflict, but with connection. Carol approached, a hesitant smile on her face. You were right, Linda. Maybe change isn't such a bad thing. Linda nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. It's not about change, Carol. It's about growth. A new chapter. In the weeks that followed, Linda's home became a hub of activity. The Jackson twins visited often, eager to learn about gardening. Rachel and Linda bonded over baking sessions, trading recipes and laughter. Even the rest of the neighborhood began to shift. Carol organized a community cleanup day, inspired by Linda's example. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now greeted each other warmly, their walls crumbling just as Linda's had. One evening, as Linda sat on her porch, Rachel joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. They watched the sunset together, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. You've changed this neighborhood, Rachel, Linda said. Rachel smiled. No, Mrs. Hilton. You did. Linda laughed softly. Call me Linda. As the stars began to emerge, Linda felt a profound sense of peace. Her world hadn't just expanded, it had blossomed. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at home. A legacy of light. It was late summer when the final piece of Linda's transformation came into place. The Jacksons, though warmly accepted by their neighbors, still felt like outsiders in a way. There were lingering whispers, subtle hesitations, that clung to the air like morning fog. But Linda, having come to understand the delicate balance between change and resistance, had one more act to complete. She had been thinking about it for days, even weeks, and now the decision had crystallized. The neighborhood needed more than just a community event or a shared space. It needed a symbol. A lasting mark of the unity and care they had all worked so hard to build. The idea. It started with a walk down the street one afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows on the pavement. Linda had been gardening again, planting rows of daisies that would bloom in the spring, when she noticed the old oak tree near the community park. The tree was magnificent, its trunk thick with age, its branches reaching toward the heavens like outstretched arms. Yet, over the years, the park around it had fallen into disrepair. It wasn't that the tree had been forgotten, but it had become more of a symbol of neglect than a proud centerpiece. Linda paused, then turned toward Rachel, who was working in her own garden across the way. She waved her over. Rachel, Linda said, her voice thoughtful. I think we should do something for the oak tree. Rachel squinted, her brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? Linda's eyes gleamed. We should restore it. Bring the park back to life. A gathering place for all of us to share. But we make it special, something that honors the community we're building. Rachel nodded slowly. You mean like a project we all work on together? Linda smiled. Exactly. A project that reminds us of what we've all built, and how much more we can do if we work together. The Oak Project. The following week, Linda took her idea to the HOA meeting. The room, still tense from previous debates, fell quiet when she presented it. It's not about the tree, really, she said, her voice calm but firm. It's about the life we're creating here, together. This tree is a part of all of us. Let's give it the care it deserves. Carol, despite her usual skepticism, seemed intrigued. "What are you proposing?" Linda continued, outlining a plan to clean up the park, plant new flowers, and build a small stage for community events. The idea was to create a space where neighbors could gather for festivals, performances, and casual get-togethers. It would be a way to truly honor the connection that had formed over time. Carol, after some thought, spoke up. "I think it could work. But we'll need help. This isn't going to be cheap or easy." "I'm ready to pitch in," Rachel said quickly. "I'll talk to the Jacksons, see if they can help with the landscaping." Linda nodded, her heart swelling. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the realization of the vision she had for this place, this community. Within weeks, volunteers from all over the neighborhood began working on the project. Children played while parents and grandparents cleared away debris, trimmed back overgrown bushes, and planted new flowers. The Jackson family, along with a handful of others, worked side by side with Linda and Rachel, their efforts coming together in harmony. The unveiling. The park took shape slowly but surely, transforming before everyone's eyes. The old oak tree was pruned and treated, its branches spreading wide, offering shade to those who gathered beneath it. A stone pathway now wound its way around the tree, with benches placed thoughtfully around the perimeter. Vibrant flowers bloomed in color-filled bursts, and a small stage, made from reclaimed wood, stood proudly at one end. It was the day of the unveiling when the entire neighborhood gathered in anticipation. Linda stood at the edge of the park, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Beside her was Rachel, who grinned widely. Together, they watched as families streamed into the park, taking in the transformation. "I never thought this could happen," Rachel said softly, her eyes scanning the space. "It's amazing." Linda nodded, a lump in her throat. "It's all of us. Every person here made this happen." As the crowd grew, Carol walked up to Linda, her face softened with a smile. "You were right, Linda. This is more than a park. It's a testament to everything we've learned together. It's a reminder that even old trees, like us, can bloom again." Linda's heart swelled as Carol placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've changed this place, Linda. You've shown us all how to grow. A lasting legacy." The Jacksons, too, had found their place in the community. The twins had formed lasting friendships with the other kids, while Rachel's baking became a neighborhood favorite, earning her the affectionate title of the best pie maker in town. Even Chief Jackson became an integral part of the park's maintenance committee, helping with landscaping and security. Linda and Rachel continued to work side by side, their friendship growing with each passing season. And though the Oak project was completed, the legacy of what it represented, unity, compassion, and transformation, had only just begun. Years later, when Linda sat in the park on the same bench by the oak tree, she would often reflect on how far she had come. Her home was no longer a place of solitude but a part of something much larger, something that pulsed with life. As the sun began to set over the park, Linda would smile at the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, and the warmth of the community she had helped create. In the distance, the old oak tree stood tall, its branches heavy with memories and new growth. The walls that had once confined her had long since crumbled, replaced by a legacy of light, one that would continue to grow, season after season, for generations to come. And in that light, Linda found her true home.